Christian psyche is split. And that means everybody, whether you're a professing Christian or not, it's irrelevant. It's part of the psychology, the collective psychology we all share. We're all split because the God image is split. And the split occurred even before Christianity. It was split by Plato and the Stoics, so that it's got a philosophical source too. That split, that paradoxical doubleness of deity, is what undergoes reconciliation and transformation when an individual human consciousness engages this depth issue in its own individual life. Then that little piece of the collective psyche that is carried by the individual has been transformed. And if there are enough individuals who have had this experience and who have participated in this transformation of the God image, then they act as a kind of leaven to society as a whole, and very gradually a new collective God image is born out of that society as a whole. You know, the question often comes up in modern thinking, is Christianity doomed? Has it run out? Jung makes a very interesting point in that regard. He points out that the Christian myth itself contains as part of its thematic structure the death of God. I want to see if I can spell this out because I think it's of some importance. According to the Christian myth, and I elaborate all this in my book, The Christian Archetype. According to the Christian myth, the God, remember that in psychological terms, whenever I use the phrase God, I'm referring to the psychological God image. Psychology does not presume to know anything about the metaphysical deity. We're talking about the psychological God image, which is within the range of empirical experience. But according to the Christian myth, God descends to earth by incarnating himself as a man through the agency of the Holy Spirit, who impregnates the Virgin Mary, and God as man then lives a human life on the earth, incarnated. He goes through the passion, he dies, and he's resurrected and then ascends to heaven. So that in his incarnated form, the myth describes the deity as passing through a death. What then happens after his death, according to the Christian myth, is that the Holy Spirit descends again on Pentecost. And this time, according to the church dogma, the church is born. Pentecost is considered to be the birthday of the church. So that the incarnation cycle repeats itself. The Holy Ghost, the deity, descends and is incarnated a second time in the church, which describes itself as the body of Christ. Then, according to certain theologians, this is stated explicitly. The church, as the body of Christ, is obliged to live out the same faithful sequence as did Christ. That means the church must also go through a passion and a death. Now, the church projects that anticipation onto the last days, as far off as possible. But considering this psychologically, we might consider that that's happening right now. That the church, as the body of Christ, the collective incarnation of Christ, so to speak. Christ was the first individual incarnation. The church was the second collective incarnation, who must also go through the passion and death and resurrection. And now, according to my understanding, the resurrection will then initiate a third cycle in which the Holy Spirit will be now incarnating itself in empirical individual human beings. That's Jung's point. And as you can see, as I spell it out that way, that's a consistent and quite appropriate continuation and reinterpretation of the Christian myth. Jung was very concerned that the treasuries of the treasure of the Christian myth not be lost to modern man, and what he's done is he's provided a transformative and reinterpretive understanding of it in his notion of continuing incarnation, which preserves all of the rich Christian symbolism, you see, but now understood on a psychological individual level. And this is my understanding of what the new epoch means and why Jung is an epochal man. We are in for some very grave disturbances in the collective social fabric of Western society. And Jung was keenly aware of that. And he even made the remarkable statement in a letter that he wrote answer to Job because he did not want his moral laxity to allow things to drift towards the impending catastrophe. What he revealed there, and is expressed very clearly, is that his book, Answer to Job, is the antidote to the apocalypse. If one can understand Answer to Job, one will be in a position to survive psychologically the onslaught of the apocalypse, of the transition from one epoch to another, because he describes the psychological meaning of this collective event. And what it means, without summarizing the book, which is impossible in this setting, what it means is that a process is going on in which the God image is undergoing transformation. And the process of that transformation requires human awareness of the divine nature in order for that nature to change. That puts it in a nutshell. In fact, I'll repeat it. The essence of answer to Job, which is the antidote allowing one to survive psychologically the apocalypse, is the realization that the apocalypse is a process in the transformation of God in which by means of entering human consciousness, the divine nature can undergo a transformation and change its nature. It's all spelled out in the book of Job. I also discuss this matter in my little book on Blake's engravings for the book of Job, called The Encounter with the Self. You see, part of the divine nature. Remember, I'm speaking psychologically, not metaphysically. Psychologists know nothing about metaphysics. Depth psychologists are good Kantians who recognize that metaphysical statements are beyond human possibility, and so that they make no metaphysical assumptions at all. We're talking about the psychological God image, that God image is a union of opposites. It's not only Christ, it's also Satan. It's not only Yahweh of the book of Job, it's also Behemoth and Leviathan. And that paradoxical God image with that dual nature is in the process of being transformed through being experienced by human consciousness. Being seen by human consciousness is the agent of its transformation. One individual at a time. It's not done collectively, not done in committee. It's done one lonely individual at a time who has the experience of the divine ambiguity, and in the process of that experience penetrates that paradoxical self with human consciousness, which transforms it. This is the process I see now in its initial phases, and which will continue with more and more intensity in the collective. You see, if we have more experiences of the same nature as the Nazi Holocaust, those are psychological events. Those are expressions of the collective human psyche. They weren't natural disasters. They didn't fall out of heaven. They were psychological events. So they are phenomena describing the nature of the collective psyche. And that's the kind of stuff that we're in store for as we go through this this catastrophic transformation from one age to the next, in which the divine image is undergoing transformation.
The world hangs on a thin thread, and that is the psyche of man. Nowadays, we are not threatened by elementary catastrophes. There is no such thing as an H-bomb. That is all man's doing. We are the great danger. The psyche is the great danger. What if something goes wrong with the psyche?
So that's Dr. Edinger's piece, and I didn't mean to suggest that I was shushing you, Agatha, but it's the response to your point is one that's somewhat complex, and so I wanted to be able to do it in person. I can't really. If I could write a 5,000 word essay on chat, I would, but I only get 200 characters like everybody else, so I just have to proceed. But I think one critical thing for us to remember here is what we're talking about and what Drs. Edinger and Jung are talking about, but maybe didn't say so explicitly, from a societal point of view, is that the self of society, the collective unconscious, which is, you can think of it as the God image in society, is looking for a definition, let's say, of what the God image is. And we see in American politics today the red state, blue state neurosis, which is definitely a reflection of an individual psychology, but on a national basis. And one of the things that we need to look toward is how we can circumscribe that neurosis and mature beyond it. And when Drs. Edinger and Jung are talking about transition of the God image, they're saying that the human psyche, both from an individual perspective and a societal perspective, has to move on in order for human beings to survive. I mean, Dr. Jung, at the end of his life, when he said the world is hanging by a thin thread, and that is the psyche of man, he meant in the collective. And so here we are, we're stuck in our collective, whatever it is, and we see sort of the psychic epidemics sloshing back and forth. Now, the worst example was Nazi Germany, and also Imperial Japan, and to a lesser extent Italy during World War I, and then Stalin's Russia immediately after the war. And those were collective epidemics that were uncontrollable by individuals. But somehow we need to be able to see that in the case of the United States and our politics, we need to see that it is a one big individual nation in this case, and the solution, as Dr. Jung or Dr. Edinger was suggesting earlier in that video. I'm going to talk about that on Monday night. We're going to have our reading group sessions all online from now on. We agreed to that this week. So beginning this coming Monday, we'll be doing our Carl Jung Depth Psychology reading group sessions from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time online. But a little earlier in this video, which I'm going to share on Monday night, Dr. Edinger was talking about how individuation is the process by which you can pull out of these dualities, and by pulling yourself up above them. And so in the case of the United States, and by the way, he said that the method for doing that is active imagination. And so I'll be talking about active imagination on Monday. I'm not going to go into it today because it's a complicated area. But fundamentally, it means that some of us have to start envisioning what a America that's unified, a United States that's unified politically, or at least somewhat. It's always going to have rough edges for sure, but an America that matures past its red state, blue state neurosis, what that would look like. And I think I have some ideas about that, which I'll talk about later. But this was intended today to be a lecture about this section of Answer to Job, and it is relevant. So, and so just to further comment, Agatha, in terms of how it gets done, yes, we have to educate people more broadly. That's what I'm trying to do a bit on this YouTube channel, to help others understand what we need to do. But ultimately, we need to teach our children these things because, for example, half of the marriages in the United States collapse. And there's no excuse for that. When you know about Dr. Jung's psychology, we could be educating our children much better in terms of what to expect in marriage and what to look for in terms of a marriage partner. And if we started to educate people better in depth psychology, we would have a better country and a better world. And so yes, it has to be taught in a broader way, but it has to be captured in the heart. We have to first understand it ourselves. And then, as Dr. Edinger says, individual by individual, it will serve as a leaven to change the world and do the transition that needs to happen into the next age, when we realize that, oh, by the way, all human beings are on one planet and we're all in it together. We're all in the soup together. And somehow we have to mature past our differences, or our big differences at least, and in order for our species to survive. If we don't, we're going to have a big problem. Miles says, good morning. Gray says, awesome news about the group. Please thank them for allowing us to join. Yes, and I think our other members will be joining on Mondays also, but online. So we've moved out of the spaghetti restaurant, which was certainly a necessary part of the evolution of what's happening now, because 2 years ago, or June 1st, 2016, when I began this process, I had no idea how this would evolve, none whatsoever. I thought about just putting a few videos out on YouTube, and you see what it's become, and it's growing every day, and so I'm very excited about that. And I have to find ways to now keep it in a manageable level so that I can live my life too. But anyway, we will be doing, for now, it'll be the weekly group meeting on Monday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, and a weekly lecture meeting like this one every Thursday at 1:30. For the next couple of months, it'll be Answer to Job, because it's going to take us that long to get through it, but that's my intention. Yes, and we learn by doing, by failing, and I've done a lot of failing in my life. I've done a lot of succeeding also. And so I'm a great believer in the Job archetype, which Dr. Edinger and Dr. Jung taught us, which is contest, defeat, lamentation, and rebirth, and you keep getting reborn into a better version of yourself. So I don't know where I'm going with this, but we're going. Anyway, we are going. Miles says, yes, the unequally yoked might be solved. Yes, in a sense that's true. I mean, we're all still going to be on the same planet in the end, but maybe we'll have leaders who have more wisdom than the ones we see today around the world, not only in the United States, but everywhere in the world, and one can certainly hope about that. So now I want to get into this talk about Answer to Job, and so what I'm going to do is shift my position so I'm still in the picture, and I'm going to give you access to my notes on this. And these notes are based on two books. They're based on Answer to Job, of course, and this is the 50th edition Answer to Job book that you can find on Amazon, but it's also based on Transformation of the God Image by Edward Edinger, and this book contains Dr. Edinger's 10 lectures on Answer to Job, which he gave over a period of 3 months or so, many years ago, back in the 80s, and it was turned into this book. And interestingly, you've probably seen some of my videos about Lawrence Jaffe's book, and you saw that Lawrence Jaffe was the interviewer on the other Edinger video, which I've mentioned a number of times. And Dr. Jaffe wrote the introduction to this book, to Transformation of the God Image. And down here you can see forward by Lawrence Jaffe. So it's a very small group, I guess, that was prepared to talk about the religious aspects of Dr. Jung's work. But so anyway, going on with 609, this is a section that I like very much because it introduces the divine wisdom of the feminine principle, and it's very powerful. And I'm going to share on the video my notes, so if you want to go back through my notes, you'll be able to do that. And I'll create, if you are not a member of our Dropboxes yet, you can send an email to me at skip.conover@gmail.com, and I will add you to the Dropbox. I already have one viewer who has requested that today, so I'll be adding that viewer a little later as soon as we finish this live broadcast. But if you are not a member of our Dropbox, you should join it. If you happen to be interested in any of my books, they're available for free on the Dropbox in electronic form, so you don't have to run off and buy them. Not that I think anybody would. But anyway, to the extent that's of interest, there's only one of them that's directly about Jungian psychology, and that's Political Psychology, New Ideas for Activists. And then two of them were written in my pen name, and those reflect my confrontation with the unconscious and my shadow. And so if you read them, please go into them with due warning. They do contain some erotica, and I now recognize that from my shadow side. That's the part that gets my motor running, I guess, in that part of my life. But anyway, I see how that came out in the novel and in the book of poetry I wrote. And you can, let's see, I'll put my pen name up here so you can find it on YouTube if you want, but you could also find these books for free in our Dropbox, as I say. Okay, but caveat emptor if you look at those pieces. And I also wrote a book in 2007 called Tsunami of Blood, and that was based on what was going on politically in the United States around the Iraq War. And so, anyway, okay, so point one. We're at paragraph 609, and so the figure of wisdom, Sophia, emerges, and this is sapientia. I'm glad I can change these things on the fly when I find mistakes. And so what was going on was that in Jewish patriarchal culture in the period 500 BC, Yahweh was seen as a tough character, and that's what was happening with Job. And there had to be there had to be a balance, and this was things going on in the psyche. Now remember, you see a few feminine principal ideas coming up. For example, in the story of Abraham and Isaac, a scourge of the ancient world was that early ancients saw God as this nasty fellow, and they thought that they had to make sacrifices to God. And so you saw that all over the world in every culture where there was human sacrifice, and it was truly the scourge of the ancient world. And so when Abraham had his vision that said to sacrifice the goat instead of his son Isaac, that was a turning point in the Jewish culture. And so we stopped sacrificing our youth to a God that is not too great. But as you see, we're still sacrificing youth. I mean, when in the United States we're sacrificing youth because we won't control our guns, finally we have youth fighting back. I mean, when Newtown happened, and it so happened that the superintendent of schools in Newtown was a high school classmate of mine, and she had a very tough time at that time. But when you kill a bunch of kindergartners, then the other kindergartners really can't fight back. But with Parkland, when you kill people that are coming into maturity, then they can fight back. And so we see already, just in the last 6 weeks, what kind of psychological thing can go on in the psyche, a kind of psychic epidemic that says something has to be done. And I'm not sure that we've had enough bad results so far to force the changes that we need. But obviously, other countries that work perfectly well, that are in the sort of a class of countries like the United States, for better or for worse, but they have more strict gun laws, and the result is they have far fewer gun deaths than we do here in the United States. And so one of the things that will be happening in the human psyche, and it may take a couple hundred years, who knows, is that we're going to have a more mature attitude toward guns. But that is sort of an example of the type of thing that also was happening at the time of Job. So when we're talking about Dr. Edinger, Dr. Jung, and these biblical stories, what these men were doing was they were basically psychoanalyzing the ancients based on what the ancients wrote, in the same sense that you can psychoanalyze Skip circa 1993 by reading my novel. Okay, and if you read my novel, you would see where my psyche was at that time. I think I finally understood that. So, so anyway, okay. So at that time, there was a very strong masculine element, but the feminine was also there. It just had not been constellated. It hadn't been brought forth into consciousness as yet. And so what can be seen is that time, the feminine starts to push through a little more. I'm saying that at the time of Abraham, which was even a couple 1,500 or 2,000 years earlier, there was a little bit of feminine principle emerging in Abraham when he decided not to sacrifice Isaac. And that was a change in the structure of human thought. And so at the time of Job, we're having the realization, or the Jews were having the realization, that Yahweh had two sides. And what Dr. Jung is saying is that it's at this time that wisdom reemerges. So what he's saying is that Yahweh was the masculine personification of the collective unconscious, and wisdom was needed. And wisdom can be considered the feminine personification of the God image. Okay, so wisdom is the feminine side, the feminine principle side of the collective unconscious. And so it was described variously by the Greeks as Sophia, by the Latin-speaking people as sapientia Dei, and by in Hebrew as chochma. And it appears in Greece, in Greek form, about between 300 and 600 BC. And it's a central image of the Greek philosophers, the lovers of Sophia. So Philo equals love, Sophie equals Sophia, and so philosophy was the lovers of wisdom. And so if you look at the Bible in Proverbs 1 through 9, chapters 1 through 9, you see the description of Sophia, and here's how she describes herself in Proverbs chapter 8, verses 12 through 31, as written in the New American Bible, which is a Catholic version of the Bible. And I'm not Catholic, but anyway, I like this description, so I'm going to read it to you. I, wisdom, dwell with experience and judicious knowledge. Mine are counsel and advice. Mine is strength, understanding. By me kings reign and lawgivers establish justice. By me princes govern and nobles rule the earth. Those who love me I also love, and those who seek me find me. With me are riches and honor. My fruit is better than gold. On the way of duty I walk along the paths of justice. The Lord begot me, the firstborn of his ways, the forerunner of his prodigies of long ago. From of old I was poured forth when there were no depths. I was brought forth when there were no fountains or springs of water, before the mountains were settled into place. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he made firm the skies above, then he fixed fast. Okay, I'm going to fix that. Then he fixed fast the foundations of the earth. I guess it's when he fixed fast the foundations of the earth, when he set for the sea its limits, so that the waters should not transgress his command. Then I was beside him as his craftsman. I was his delight day by day, playing before him all the while, playing on the surface of his earth, and I found delight in the sons of men. Now, in the Song of Songs, this becomes a major wisdom text, and the Shulamite is later identified with Sophia, about 500 to 400 BC. So the whole drama of the Shulamite and her lover corresponds to the perpetual love play of the Hieros Gamos between Yahweh and Sophia. And in a couple of minutes, I have a definition of the Hieros Gamos, but basically it's the divine wedding, and it's the idea that the masculine and feminine natures are there from the beginning. So in paragraph 610, there's mention of Ecclesiasticus, which again is an apocryphal holy book. In other words, it doesn't appear in the Protestant Bible, but Dr. Edinger was referring to this, and so I need to refer back to his page 25. Except I'm not seeing anything there. So maybe it's 20. It's 20. Here. Yes, here it is. Okay, so it's in paragraph 610 of Answer to Job, where Dr. Jung is referring to the wisdom texts, and they include the Book of Wisdom and Ecclesiasticus, written about 200 BC, where wisdom says of herself. Now, keep in mind, at this time, there must have been lots of men writing these things, but this was their feminine side coming through. And as you see me getting emotional in these readings, this is my feminine side coming through, and which should be obvious, I guess. But anyway, here's what she says. I came out of the mouth of the Most High and covered the earth as a cloud. I dwelt in high places, and my throne is in a cloudy pillar. I alone encompassed the circuit of heaven and walked in the bottom of the deep. I had power over the waves of the sea and over all the earth and over every people and nation. He created me from the beginning before the world, and I shall never fail. In the holy tabernacle I served before him, and so was I established in Sion. Likewise in the beloved city he gave me rest, and in Jerusalem was my power. I was exalted like a cedar in Libanos, and as a cypress tree upon the mountains of Hermon. I was exalted like a palm tree in En-Gedi, and as a rose plant in Jericho, as a fair olive tree in a pleasant field, and grew up as a plane tree by the water. I gave a sweet smell like cinnamon and asphalthus, and I yielded a pleasant odor like the best myrrh. As the turpentine tree I stretched out my branches, and my branches are the branches of honor and grace. As the vine brought I forth pleasant savor, and my flowers are the fruit of honor and riches. I am the mother of fair love, and fear, knowledge, and holy hope. I therefore, being eternal, am given to all my children which are chosen of me. So, for those of you that thought the feminine principle emerged at the time of Susan B. Anthony, so there. The feminine principle has been held back for millennia, but nonetheless, it was recognized at the time of the ancient Jews, at least. So let's see. This is. And then I'll read very briefly Dr. Edinger's favorite passage, which comes from Ecclesiasticus, chapter 4, which is from the New American Bible. Wisdom instructs her children and admonishes those who seek her. He who loves her loves life. Those who seek her out win her favor. He who holds her fast inherits glory. Wherever he dwells, the Lord bestows blessings. Those who serve her serve the Holy One. Those who love her, the Lord loves. He who obeys her judges nations. He who hearkens to her dwells in her innermost chambers. If one trusts her, he will possess her. His descendants too will inherit her. She walks with him as a stranger, and at first she puts him to the test. Fear and dread she brings upon him and tries him with her discipline. With her precepts she puts him to the proof until his heart is fully with her. Then she comes back to bring him happiness and reveal her secrets to him. And from the Wisdom of Solomon, also in the New American Bible, in her is a spirit intelligent, holy, unique, manifold, subtle, agile, clear, unstained, certain, loving the good, keen, unhampered, beneficent, kindly, firm, secure, tranquil, all-powerful, all-seeing, and pervading all spirits, though they be intelligent, pure, and very subtle. For wisdom is mobile beyond all motion, and she penetrates and pervades all things by reason of her purity. She is an aura of the might of God. She who is one can do all things and renews everything, while herself perjuring and passing into holy souls from age to age, she produces friends of gods and prophets. Okay. So in 100 to 300 AD, Sophia appears as one of the eons in the pleroma, and she is not bounded by time and space. Now this is the Gnostics, and she fell into matter. Simon Magus finds her in a brothel in Tyre and made her his partner. Now he says this is an amalgam of the divine Sophia of the Greeks and Helen of Troy and the Jewish tradition. So in the collective unconscious now, what's happening is that the Greek idea of Sophia and the Jewish idea of Sophia start to merge as these societies start to interact. And so in medieval philosophy, now keep in mind that Sophia is also considered matter, and so in medieval philosophy, she was considered to be the eternal form out of which God created the universe. And for eternal form, you could consider, the earth or matter, because remember, the word matter comes from mater or mother, and so then let's see. So then in alchemy, the personification of the prima materia, asking to be rescued, seeking rescue by the alchemists. And it's caught in the dark embrace of matter, requiring rescue. Now remember the damsel in distress. Well, that's part of this archetype that gets constellated and has to be saved. And I think I spoke the last time about how I'm a sucker for the damsel in distress. So anyway, Marie-Louise von France, who was a close working associate of Dr. Jung for all her life from the time she was 19 until his death, wrote a book called Aurora Consurgens, and she edited and commented on it. Aurora Consurgens is a Gnostic text, but she made comments on it, and in the Jungian sense. So she says, at first it's the same personification we see in Proverbs, Ecclesiastica, and Wisdom of Solomon. In patristic literature, she was mostly interpreted as Christ, the pre-existent logos, or as the sum of the eternal forms of the self-knowing primordial causes, exemplars or prototypes of the mind of God, the sum of archetypal images in the mind of God. Now, I think that what we have to imagine here is that the collective unconscious is, in effect, the sum total of all the archetypal images in the mind of the state or the mind of the individual in terms of the self. So anyway, there's always a girl requiring rescue from matter, and also the dancing girl of Confucius, and we might add Sabine Spielrein and Toni Wolff for Jung, and I've had my own run-ins with the damsel in distress, as I've said. Okay, so if there's any comment, I will be glad to respond to it, but otherwise I'm going to move on to point 2 in the hope that within the next hour I can complete the 7 points that were raised by Dr. Edinger. So point 2, paragraph 16, Yahweh projects his own tendency of unfaithfulness on a scapegoat, namely Job, and he treats Job like a jealous husband. Job is the personification of Israel. Now, the point that Dr. Jung was making was that originally Yahweh made a covenant with Israel, and Israel took up the feminine role vis-a-vis Yahweh. But those ties start to loosen as there's more interaction in the ancient world, in the Levant, in the Eastern Mediterranean area, between, let's say, Alexandria and going up through to Greece and on into the Tigris and Euphrates area. There was a lot of interaction. Remember, Alexander the Great lived around in the 330s BC, and so he had conquered all the way from Alexandria in Egypt all the way over to India by that time. And as I previously mentioned, at 500 BC, there were already 100 million human beings on the planet. So there were a lot of people, and they were going back and forth. And, you know, Alexander the Great conquered everything that he could reach. My father used to joke that everybody in the Western world is descended from Alexander the Great. And you know, that may be true, and he's probably everybody in large swaths of the world are descended from Alexander the Great, and a lot of other people as well, of course. But anyway, so Yahweh is loosening his ties with Israel, but he's feeling bad about it. So he's pretending that Job is unfaithful, and what's really going on, he's projecting that, and Yahweh doubts his own faithfulness. And then Yahweh remembers Sophia in his self-reflection, and it becomes an imperative necessity. Israel becomes like a collective ego, and Yahweh like the self of the world, of humanity at that time. And mind you, we're talking about Jewish humanity at that time, but all of us are psychologically, all of us in the Western world are psychologically descended from them. And so Yahweh is the husband and Israel is the wife. Now, let's see how this goes up so I don't go too far. Okay, so Edinger says on page 57 of Transformation of the God Image, remember in Ion, Jung stated that the anima or animus can be realized only through a relationship to a partner of the opposite sex. I think today we would say it's a partner of the opposite principle, whether it's a gender, sex, or not is a different issue. But anyway, this is the way Dr. Jung formulated it. So it's the opposite can only be experienced through a partner of the opposite sex, because only in such a relation do their projections become operative. And this is the same idea for Yahweh. He had a consort. His consort was Sophia, but he forgot about her, or more precisely, he never really knew her. Just as the ego in order to become conscious of the contrasexual other, must experience a real encounter with the opposite sex through a relationship, so must Yahweh do the same in order to become conscious of his other. And because Yahweh is eternal and immortal, his other is temporal and mortal. He needs that other in order to become conscious of his inner contrariness. And so in page 57 of TGI, reflection on this analogy between the marriage relationship and the relationship between the ego and the self, he realizes that and talks about it in his essay called Marriage as a Psychological Relationship. And that can be transferred almost in its entirety to the ego self relationship. So we have an internal marriage between our ego and our self. But there is no birth of consciousness without pain. We have to have pain in order to have consciousness. Okay, so moving along here. So point 3, Yahweh has this infidelity complex, and so self-reflection becomes an imperative necessity. For this wisdom is needed, and what Yahweh is doing is entertaining the prospect of being unfaithful to Israel in order to have a relation with Sophia, who had Greek origin, right? So Yahweh has lost sight of his pleromatic coexistence with Sophia since the days of creation. Her place was taken by the covenant with the chosen people, who were thus forced into the feminine role. So Yahweh is having this external love relationship with Israel, and then later withdrew the projection. So this is like the love at first sight thing in our personal relationships, where you have love at first sight, and then you withdraw the projection, and you find out what the person is really like once the honeymoon is over. He's going to turn from a projected relationship to his consort to a conscious direction relationship to Sophia herself. The anticipated infidelity is then projected upon Israel, represented by Job. And this is where the Byzantine, or I think it's called the Byzantine captivity, starts to come in for Israel. But so there are two very important parts of Answer to Job that are in these particular paragraphs. One of these comes up in point 4, which is found in paragraph 617. Whoever knows God has an effect on him. And so in terms of what this means from a religious perspective is that if you know the duality of God, then God for you is going to change, and it will gradually change the God image, at least within you or within your society. So what we have seen in the last 150 years in the United States, for example, since Susan B. Anthony started to do her work, and mind you, she suffered greatly because she worked 50 years before her death and never saw the vote for women, but she worked on it for 50 years. But that was, I think Drs. Edinger and Jung would say that she was an emanation of the feminine principle coming to consciousness in the United States, in the American nation, within the self of our national polis. And so obviously her work and the work of women since then, and right up through Hillary Clinton and current female politicians, is that they've had an effect on the way Americans regard the feminine principle. And obviously, patriarchal society has been fighting back right along, but nonetheless, the feminine principle has become more and more prominent as those things have constellated. So here, Edinger calls this the most important sentence in the book. Whoever knows God has an effect on him. And I don't think we can he says, I don't think we can overstate what a revolutionary and profound fact and discovery is expressed by this simple sentence. I think this is how psychotherapy works. That act of having been seen has an effect. Naturally, it is our task to communicate verbally what we see to the patient, but even in the absence of an explicit communication, the having been seen acts on the unconscious of the patient. I think this insight is so fundamental, of such fundamental importance to the collective, that this single sentence is enough to create a whole new eon, the Jungian eon. And so, in my own life, I can certainly say that having seen the results of my confrontation with the unconscious, which emerged as this novel that I wrote, which for a long time I called it the autobiography of my anima. And 25 years later, I still think that that's accurate. But it was so shocking what was there and what had been in my shadow that I didn't know what to do with it. And I put it in my drawer for 21 years. I showed it to a few people. And my wife, being a very wise woman, said to me at one point, I won't read it until you've had 10 other women read it. And I said, whoa, there's a big hurdle. But ultimately, I showed it to more than 50 of my women friends. And to my great surprise, all of them seem to have loved my novel. So go figure. But in any case, I can definitely say that from my perspective, in terms of my own unconscious, having seen what I saw that came out of that novel certainly changed my perspective on the world, both out of that novel and out of my book of poetry. So anyway, for what it's worth, those were my personal experiences. Okay, so point 5, in paragraph 619, Dr. Jung starts to talk about Adam is the prototype of the ego, and he had 2 sons, Cain and Abel, following the model of God, Christ and Satan. Another parallel, Yahweh and Adam both had 2 wives. Yahweh's 2 were Israel and Sophia. Just as the ego has 2 wives, the self has 2 wives. The outer wife and the inner wife. Now, this is the big issue, because described in a man is a split anima. One should be inner, but it often becomes outer, exteriorization of the 2 wives archetype. One of the 2 needs to be inner, one outer. In the process of discovering the inner wife, the unconscious wife is projected outward. That's when things become complicated. So here in this point 5, Dr. Edinger is basically saying why many marriages fail. And I guess there would be a two husbands archetype too, most likely. But I know that my anima still likes to project and say, wow, that's the woman for you. And I know what that woman looks like exactly, because it's a woman, a young woman with long brown hair. And the reason I know that is because for many years, I've given it to my daughter now, but for many years, I had a portrait of my mother, which was done when she was 19 years old. It was based on a photograph of her when she was, maybe she was 18, because she was a senior in high school when the photograph was taken. And my father had this done as a drawing, and then that portrait from 1947 onward was in my house. And so that became my anima. And to this day, when I run into a woman with long brown hair, my anima says, wow, I want to have that woman. That's the woman for me. And my wife does have long brown hair, and my first wife had long brown hair also. And so I know all about this anima. But nowadays, fortunately, I recognize this as my inner wife, and not my outer wife, which is my actual wife. But I'm sure that a lot of marriages fail because men get that confused and end up thinking that they need to change wives, and then they change wives and find out that yep, you got another wife, but she's not the same as your animus, so your animus goes start looking again. And I imagine for women that happens very similarly, that women also project animus out. Although maybe it's more common in men, I just don't know. But and certainly Edinger is talking about the two wives archetype. So I'm only projecting when I'm applying that to the animus. I don't know. And so anyway, in terms of the Bible, though, Eve is never allowed to forget that she was the first to fall for the serpent, and it works both ways, I think. One can observe the same phenomenon in human beings, that no conclusions were ever drawn from omniscience, wherever, in fact, people cannot deny themselves the pleasure of their emotions. Must be admitted that a fit of rage or a sulk has its secret attractions. Were that not so, most people would have acquired a little wisdom. Let's see, there was a point I wanted to make up here about, oh, right, where Dr. Edinger was talking about how psychotherapy works. And what he's saying is that if we see that this is what's going on, then it's going to change the way we think about the world. And so the same applies with our political world and the collective unconscious. So if we see that the gun debate is being changed by recognizing its craziness, let's say, in the same sense as sacrificing children was crazy at the time of Abraham, then things will change. And maybe we didn't see it at the time of Newtown, but after Parkland, it looks like a lot of people have seen it. And so if you see something that's a complex, that's a problem in the psyche, whether it's your personal complex or a complex of the collective unconscious in your society, if you recognize it as such, then it will change. And so if we recognize the red state, blue state neurosis as a neurosis, then the solution to neurosis is not curing it. We're never going to cure it because there will always be a Fox News and an MSNBC yakking about their position. But the rest of us can grow out of that, and we can put that neurosis off in a side of our psyche where it's not really influencing what we're doing, and we can think of our country in a more united way, however that may be. I've talked about it before, but I'm not going to go into it now because I'll digress from answer to Job. So, so now we're getting up to paragraph 621, but 620 in the pleromatic, or in the Tibetan Buddhists call it the Bardo state, there's a perfect interplay of cosmic forces. Now, I mentioned Michio Kaku, who's a famous cosmologist who is on TV fairly frequently, and he made the statement that all atoms are related to all other atoms in the universe. And but with creation, that is, with the division of the world into distinct processes in space and time, events begin to rub and jostle one another. So the pleroma would be this state that Michio Kaku is talking about, where there's this just a sea of atoms all attached to one another and all related to one another one way or another. But when space and time are introduced, then processes begin. And that's an important thing to think about, because in psychology we're talking about actual processes that are occurring, not only in ourselves but also in our society. And so what we see in our politics is literally the process of individuation of the United States of America. And I think I know how it will come out overall, since it has been coming out for the last 400 years. And the result of our process for the people that are in North America, be they in Canada, the United States, and to some extent also in Mexico, we have quite a different society than the societies that appear in other parts of the world. And I believe that that is because we have people from every race, creed, and color and cultural background and nationality in the United States who we call Americans today. They're all Americans, and we pretty much live in peace with one another. I mean, you have to sort of keep the cable news at arm's length, because, you know, even if they talk about something terrible that happened, like the attack on the YouTube headquarters the other day, as an example, that was a pretty terrible thing. But in the context of a population of 315 million Americans, that was a tiny little thing. And the truth is that most of us do live in peace and manage to get along with one another and go through our lives together. So anyway, so the issue is, when things start to bounce together, then the dark side starts to emerge, and that's what Satan is. And he puts a right touch here and a wrong touch there. And while unconscious creation, animals, plants, and crystals, function satisfactorily as far as we know, things are always going wrong with man. Okay, so the rest of nature just goes along and does its thing, but we have created this duality, and so Yahweh has to meddle with his creation. Divine interventions become a compelling necessity. Perfection, and so here's the big issue, which comes up into paragraph 621, the other very important paragraph in this section. Perfection is a masculine desideratum, while woman inclines her nature to completeness. And so Eve was not perfect because she fell for the serpent. Okay, so let me go on to my example based on this YouTube channel. Just as completeness is always imperfect, so perfection is always incomplete, and therefore represents a final state which is hopelessly sterile. So giving you my YouTube analogy about this particular channel that you're watching right now, I could do a perfect construction, which is a logos thing, and it's my natural thing as an INTP. My natural thing is to be an architect or a builder. And so I am constantly working on perfecting this or that little aspect of the YouTube channel. For example, this morning I had previously published these paragraphs separately, 609 to 624 separately. But this morning I took those same videos and I put them together in a single video so that you don't have to keep looking at me raising my book and saying this is what I'm reading from today. You can start and read right through for 37 minutes and get everything that we needed for today. And so that's me perfecting, okay, that's logos and so on. But it's meaningless without relatedness, which is eros, feminine, and, for example, the viewers to watch the videos in the perfect creation. So you and this conversation represents the eros side, the feminine side, where what's the point of doing a perfect YouTube channel if no one watches it? And so imperfectum carries within it the seeds of its own improvement. Perfectionism always ends in a blind alley, while completeness by itself lacks selective values. So, if I created a YouTube channel, as many young people do these days, where there's no distinct purpose to it, where they're just saying, hi, this is me, and I'm just running along doing this and that and the other thing, and so on, and there's no real purpose to it. Well, they may get a lot of viewers among other young people who are lost in life, but ultimately it's not going to get them very far, I don't think. Whereas I could create a perfect channel about Carl Jung, I suppose. If I work for the rest of my life, I can keep perfecting it, and yes, I can perfect it, but I need viewers. And whereas those kids who just turn on the YouTube for anything whatsoever, they don't have any purpose, and so they have relatedness. They're related to people, but it's not very meaningful. Whereas my perfection, unless I have relatedness to you out there, I don't have anything either. So as in Buddhism, there is a middle way, and we have to find that balance between perfection and relatedness or completeness. And so so this is where let's see. So here in 621 is the key idea in that Dr. Jung made. So at the bottom of Yahweh's marriage with Israel is a perfectionist intention, which excludes the kind of relatedness we know as eros. The lack of eros, of relationship to values, is painfully apparent in the book of Job. He's beaten up on Job left and right? So the paragon of all creation is not a man, but a monster. And so, would I be a monster if I made a perfect YouTube channel that nobody came and watched? Well, I have other aspects of my life, but in terms of the point that Dr. Jung is making, if your husband is demanding perfection, you have to point out that there's also the need to have a family and to compliment your wife on her haircut and wish her a happy anniversary in a timely way, and that sort of thing. That's completeness. Anyway, the faithfulness of his people becomes the more important to him, the more he forgets wisdom. So this is what Yahweh is learning in this particular passage here. So even Job longs for wisdom, which is nowhere to be found. At this point in human history, about 400 BCE, Job does not know enough about the Sophia, who is co-eternal with God. So Sophia was only emerging in sacred texts, in Proverbs and so on. And in the philosophers, remember we were talking about Sophia at the beginning. So Sophia is only emerging in consciousness about 500 BCE. And so in the next centuries, Sophia reveals herself and shows them the bright side. And Satan spoiled the perfection in the Garden of Eden when he brought the opposites. So Sophia is indeed the master workman. She realizes God's thoughts by clothing them in material form, which is the prerogative of all feminine beings. Her coexistence with Yahweh signifies the perpetual hieros gamos, the divine marriage in the pleroma. So archetypal situations only return when specifically called for, when constellated. So here is the definition of hieros gamos, which I pulled out of Wikipedia, and you can look it up yourself because there's much more to it than this, but this is just the beginning this is the beginning of the Wikipedia definition, which is hieros gamos, or hierogamy, which is Greek for holy marriage, is a sexual ritual that plays out a marriage between a god and a goddess, especially when enacted in a symbolic ritual where human participants represent the deities. The notion of hieros gamos does not always presuppose literal sexual interaction in ritual, but is also used in purely symbolic or mythological context, notably in alchemy and hence in Jungian psychology. So the hieros gamos is a concept that's obviously critical to understand within the context of Jungian psychology. Okay, so paragraph 620, I guess we got through, is that 625? Yeah, okay, we're beyond where we had to get to. But anyway, paragraph 625 is now going on, and the key fact here is that the emergence of the feminine betokens a new creation. And so this new creation is now taking another 500 years, believe it or not, to reveal itself, because the old God image, the Yahweh as it existed prior to the time of Job, is now going to evolve very fast in the next 500 years after that, up until the time of Christ, and start to emerge then as, quote unquote, the good God of Christianity. And so we're 2 millennia later, obviously, and the good God has been run through. And as Dr. Edinger said at the beginning of this, there has to be a new revivification of the God image in society. And so that's what we're about. The collective unconscious is doing it. And we're starting to see and be able to identify the duality. We identify it in the United States in our red state, blue state dichotomy, and also the emergence of the feminine. She's coming, and she's been coming since Sophia started to emerge in 500 BC. She's been coming, but that's a very small period in terms of the evolution of the human psyche, which has been millions of years. I mean, even if you go back to Lucy, the first identifiable human, is only 4 million years ago, and we've obviously been evolving much before that, and the duality of masculine and feminine obviously exists in every species and has been evolving in every species since the beginning, so it long predates humankind. One of Dr. Jung's positions is that the creation stories are not really about the creation of everything, not from the very beginning. It's mainly the creation since consciousness. And so the Garden of Eden story is really eating from the tree of knowledge, and it's the creation of consciousness of good and evil, and consciousness of all these opposites that we run into. Okay, so I think I'll quit at this point on the lecture, but let me just mention that next week we will attempt to do paragraphs 625 to 648. That will be the assignment for next week, and I will try to get a combined reading up before a half an hour before the session. You can find the combined reading for this week. I just posted it, so it's there now. But there is a reading of all these paragraphs, and so we'll do 625 to 648 next week, and then it starts to get really interesting. We're still in pretty basic stuff. Now I'm going to go back and look at Gray's notes here. Gray says, how do we reconcile the fact that the paragon of perfection being a monster and Christ's perfection as a man and a symbol of the self? What they say in this, Gray, is that the church basically made Christ feminine, and so Christ represents the perfect man of both the logos and the relation through the body of the body of Christ through the church, which is the feminine side. And so Christ is the perfect man, so he has both masculine and feminine, and in that sense is a symbol of the self, which Dr. Jung discusses this in very great detail in chapter 5 of Ion. I haven't read entirely chapter 5 of Ion, but I got started on it, and so I've gotten the first or 30 pages of it. Chapter 5 is about 70 pages long, and so I still have a ways to go. I have to find time to get back and read chapter 5. But in chapter 5 of Ion, Dr. Jung is talking about Christ as being a symbol of the God image, so as the complete man. So Grace says, and I haven't looked at the biblical verse, and also I'm not a biblical scholar. I will look at it. But it says, Christ says, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Some of the commentary speaks to this as complete or even merciful. Can we wrestle with the statement in Jungian terms? Yeah, I think we can, because keep in mind that in Jungian terms, the Father in heaven is actually both. It's actually Yahweh and Sophia. And Christ was coming along right at the end of the very patristic developments in the Jewish community. And so he would not have necessarily been very conscious of the feminine, but as I understand it, as I understand it from these readings, I can't put my finger on it right this minute, but that the church basically put the feminine characteristics onto Christ. So, for example, I think it was in these notes earlier, and I'll make everybody dizzy if I make you all watch as I make them go by, but in these notes earlier, I know what I can do though. Let me take this off the screen. Just a moment. Okay, so I'm going to take that off the screen, but I'm going to just quickly look through this, because somewhere in here they talk about this, and if I can find it quickly. Sorry, just give me a second. So one of the points I'm seeing as I go by here is that Yahweh needs the other, the feminine, outside of himself in the form of the nation of Israel, in order to start being conscious of something that was there from the beginning, namely Sophia, or wisdom, from the beginning of creation. And let's see here. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not finding it right offhand, but nonetheless, that's the point. I'm just going to move this aside because the camera is actually blocking my view of the chat, which is a little awkward. Let's see if I can make the picture fairly nice and move into it here. Okay, so I guess that's the best I can do right now. But basically what I recall reading in one of these things is that the church put the feminine aspects into Christ, and that's why, and into the church. I mean, obviously the Catholic Church considers itself Mother Church and so on. And so this is why Christianity has been pretty patriarchal, at least in the United States, in terms of Protestantism being the stronger of the two streams of Christianity in the United States. Many Europeans who came to the United States at the time my early ancestors did, they were running away from the 80 Years' War, where the Spanish Catholics were trying to beat the Calvinists into coming back to Mother Church. But in any case, now we see the feminine coming through in different ways, as I indicate, starting with Susan B. Anthony, but we could probably find other examples throughout history. And actually, that's probably a good PhD thesis for someone, is to identify the feminine coming through. We have examples of Saint Jeanne d'Arc, for example, Joan of Arc, who was obviously a young female, but her, she had a very strong animus, and that gave her the power to lead the French army, or some part of the French army. But we see evidence of the feminine breaking through. I think throughout history, if we went back and looked for it, we would find it. And certainly since Susan B. Anthony, it's very clear in the United States. And I'm not saying these things happen quickly. I'm not saying that the Parkland killings of 17 kids is going to solve our gun debate. It certainly will not. In fact, there have been, 6 or 7 mass shootings since then. So, so nowadays, in order to make the news, it has to, we have to have more deaths, I guess. And as Dr. Jung noted in the Red Book, things change when there's blood, and so that's what the Parkland shooting is showing us, and it doesn't mean that we're going to have an end to it soon. It may take another 100 years or 200 years to get through to people that, oh, by the way, the Second Amendment, the first 4 words are to keep a well-organized, something like a well-ordered militia. And it doesn't have to do with everyone having the right to have a Tommy gun in his house. But anyway, so that's a political observation, but we will only change, the gun debate is only going to ultimately change for the better and reduce these deaths when the blood is enough to change the hearts of the people who are preventing the change. Let's put it that way. And I'm not sure how long that will be. Obviously, some of those people have been pretty crude with the Parkland students, so their hearts need to change before anything's going to happen on that politically. Okay, any other questions, thoughts? We're we're running up against the 2-hour limit on YouTube. I'll stick with you if you have other questions about Jungian psychology or about this lesson we've talked about today. I will schedule the next session for 1 week from today, Thursday at 1:30 p.m. And it will be paragraphs 625 to 648. The next live stream the next planned live stream is the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group meeting, which will be Monday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time to about 10 p.m. And I may do another behind the scenes or another informal live stream before that. I don't know. It just depends on how my life goes in the next few days. But anybody else have any questions, thoughts? I see we still have quite a number of people online, so it's nice to have you with me. And thank you for taking the interest in this. I hope it's useful. And once again, as I say, if you want access to these notes, if you want to have a PDF copy of these notes, I will create under handouts in the Dropbox under today's date, which is 040518. That's the way I create the folder in the Dropbox, so that you can actually look things up by date. I will create a folder 040518, which will have in it these notes from today's discussion. And if you need other notes and you can't find them, just let me know. You can write to me at skip.conover@gmail.com, and I will add you to the Dropbox if you wish. And so, seeing no other comments, thanks for coming, and I will discontinue the stream at this time, and I'll see you all Monday, I hope. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.